Hi Merfolk fans, I'm Joe. Thanks for joining me at my channel today. I am going to be going through a replay here of a match I played against a burn deck a few days ago. Looking at the opening hands, I have 4 lands, an AEther Vial, and 2 Dismembers. That's a definite mulligan. On the opponent's side of things, we can see that he's actually playing Naya burn with white for access to Oboro's Charm, and green for Atarka's Command and Destructive Revelry in the sideboard. As a 3-colored deck with only 1 red land in his hand and no 1-drop creature, this looks like an easy mulligan from the opponent's side of things as well. So looking ahead, opponent chooses to mulligan, and I chose to mulligan as well. On my side of things, I have 2 blue lands and a Mutavault. A Silvergill with no other Merfolk is a little bit awkward, but still a great card. Kira to protect any creatures that I might draw into. And a Dismember, which is always a little bit of a liability against burn, but I don't know I'm playing against burn yet, and it's otherwise a very good card. On the opponent's side of things, we see he has a fetch land to give him access to more of his colors, and he has that 1-drop creature that's so important. So these are both going to be keeps. We'll both go ahead and scry. We both kept the top cards on our libraries, and very interesting to note here that the opponent chose not to crack his Arid Mesa, get a land, and cast Monastery Swiftspear. Now the only explanation for this, and it is a sort of a reasonable explanation, is let's say the opponent has 18 lands left in the deck. If he cracks his Arid Mesa now and gets a land, he'll only have 17 lands left in the deck for his next draw step, reducing his chance of hitting that second land. So there's a little bit of a trade-off here between cracking the land to play his creature on turn 1 to start pushing damage as soon as possible, which, as far as I've ever understood, is Burn's #1 priority. There's a trade-off between that and cracking the land now and reducing his chances slightly of drawing his second land. Now I have to think that getting the land, playing the 1-drop, and starting to attack has to be the correct line here, but the opponent has been playing Burn longer than I have and chose not to play his Swiftspear. Very interesting. So going to my draw step, we saw that I kept a Spreading Seas on the top of the deck. I can only play an island and pass the turn. The opponent did draw a second land in another fetch land. Just going to go ahead and crack his other fetch land here. Pay 3 life to get an untapped Sacred Foundry, play his Monastery Swiftspear, and attack me. Now Swiftspear can be a tricky card to deal with as a deck full of 2/2s like Merfolk is, or 2 power creatures I should say. Silvergill is only a 2/1. With only a single prowess trigger, Monastery Swiftspear can go up to a 2/3 very easily, and it becomes very difficult to interact with that 3 toughness, at least early in the game with Merfolk before we get Lords out on the table. So knowing that the Swiftspear stands a decent chance at doing 2, 3, 4 damage to me, I just choose to sort of head it off at the pass and use the Dismember in my hand now rather than letting it gather dust. So I go down to 16, the opponent's already at 17, I'll untap, draw a Lord, which is great. I'll opt to put the Wanderwine Hub out, revealing Silvergill to bring it in untapped, and play a Spreading Seas on his Sacred Foundry. So I saw the opponent keep his Arid Mesa untapped all the way through his first draw step on his second turn. That indicated to me that he was very short on lands. That's why I chose to go with Spreading Seas that turn instead of something like Silvergill Adept to start pushing more damage earlier. I saw that the opponent was land short and wanted to take him further off of his mana. So we saw the opponent miss his land drop again. He chose again not to crack the land in order to not diminish the number of lands in his deck, thus reducing the likelihood of him drawing into his 3rd land. So for my turn, I hit a Cursecatcher, which is great because I'm going to be able to play the Mutavault, play a Silvergill, and play a Cursecatcher all in one turn. So play the Silvergill, reveal the Cursecatcher, no drawback because I can just go ahead and play the Cursecatcher. I drew into a second Mutavault off of the Silvergill Adept, and I'm going to go ahead and pass the turn back to the opponent. Now realizing that there's a lot of tempo at stake here, he cracks the Bloodstained Mire finally, is paying 3 life to get another Sacred Foundry, and is going to go ahead and shoot a bolt at my Silvergill Adept, which to me seems a little bit strange. Burn's plan, as I mentioned earlier, is just to push damage, ticking our life total down as quickly as possible. The opponent, really short on lands, is probably just starting to feel the pressure of my aggressive Merfolk deck and needs to slow my clock down. So he chooses, instead of hitting me with the lightning bolt, to take one of my creatures off the table. I can respect that, but as far as I understand, I think that it's totally not typical of how burn decks play their games. The opponent did draw into a third land, is going to pay 2 life to bring it in untapped, and will pay 2 mana right now to cast Searing Blaze, having hit landfall to kill my Cursecatcher and deal 3 damage to me. Now, for those of you who are a little bit inexperienced playing the burn matchup, the card says Searing Blaze deals 1 damage to target player and 1 damage to target creature that player controls. Now, the opponent is not allowed to cast Searing Blaze if I have no legal creature targets for it. However, as long as I have a target on the table when they put the card onto the stack, even if that creature leaves the battlefield before Searing Blaze resolves, it will still deal 3 damage to me. The spell will do as much as it can once it has sufficient targets. So in this case, it's going to target the Cursecatcher, and even if I sacrifice the Cursecatcher, Searing Blaze has still targeted me as the player, and even if the opponent chooses not to pay for the Cursecatcher, Searing Blaze is still going to deal 3 damage to me, the player. So Cursecatcher dies. I lose 3 and draw into a second Island Walk Lord. So I play out my Mutavault, and at this point I see that the opponent is playing these searing effects in his main deck and could use some protection in the form of Kira. So I go ahead, play her out, and pass the turn back to the opponent. We can see that he's also splashing green for access to Wild Negate, and he's going to cast a Lava Spike at my face, so I'm going to go from 13 down to 10. Wild Negate sees a plains and a forest, a plains and a mountain, so it's fully powered as a 3/3. Now, with Kira protecting my creatures, I mean, the opponent doesn't have access to red mana right now anyway. Playing out an Island Walk Lord with access to Island Walk and attacking with Mutavault and Kira for 5 damage is going to be clearly the best play here. So we swing for 2, plus 3 is 5. The opponent's going to go from 12 down to 7. Heal, untap. Draw into a Rift Bolt. Now you can see that Kira does some decent work in this matchup, as well as Spreading Seas obviously doing a great job. The opponent is pretty starved on mana, and he has a 2-drop, a 2-drop, and a 3-drop in hand. Without any other spells being played, I can activate both Mutavaults and attack with 6 Island Walk and 2 in the air for lethal, with access to another Lord in hand if I want to. So we can see that the opponent can't hit one of our creatures through the Kira shield this turn since he can't cast 2 spells. So he thinks about attacking with Wild Negate for a little while. Ultimately decides to suspend Rift Bolt, hoping that for some reason I don't get lethal next turn. I hit my 5th land. I play it out, the Cavern of Souls, name Merfolk, play out the 2nd Lord, and activate a Mutavault as a 4/4, swing with Mutavault, Lord of Atlantis as a 3/3, and Kira Great Glassspinner as a 2/2 in the air for 9 damage. In the air, and with Island Walk, it's all evasive. The opponent can't do anything about it and chooses to scoop that one up. So game 1 to Merfolk. Let's go ahead and see how game 2 went. Okay, opening hand on the Merfolk side of things is fantastic. 2 blue sources, a Mutavault as another attacker, 2 Silvergills, going to draw some cards. Island Walk Lord, potentially make our creatures unblockable, and Merrow Reejerey will either accelerate our mana or tap down some of his creatures. On the opponent's side of things, the hand looks a little bit similar to his opening 7 in game 1 that he chose to mulligan. However, there's a big difference in the fact that he has not 1 but 2 1-drop red creatures in Goblin Guide and Monastery Swiftspear. He'll be able to get both of those going with his single mountain. He also has a Lightning Bolt as a 1-drop spell, and everything else is going to require either green mana or an additional red mana. So the opponent can have a strong opening, but is going to be looking to draw into lands. From my perspective, I have all I need here, so I think that I chose to keep and the opponent chose to keep, leading with Mountain into Goblin Guide. The Goblin Guide reveals an AEther Vial off the top of the deck. Can't draw that. I can only take the, whenever Goblin Guide attacks, defending player reveals the top card of his or her library. If it's a land card, I can put it into my hand. Aether Vial is not a land card, though it's sort of close to one. I'm going to take 2 damage from Goblin Guide, going down to 18. Draw that Aether Vial and play the Aether Vial. Definitely not a bad first draw step. So the opponent misses his land drop this turn, plays out the Swift Spear, attacks with Goblin Guide and the Swift Spear, revealing a Tidebinder Mage. Now again, that's not a land, but it's very nice to see. It gives me a little bit of information to plan my next turn. During my upkeep, I will put a counter on Aether Vial and draw that Tidebinder Mage. Now this guy's going to come out right now. He's going to slow down the opponent's attacks and start to establish my board presence. Now given a choice of Goblin Guide or Swift Spear to name with Tidebinder Mage, I pretty much always choose Swift Spear. I explained in Game 1 that with a single prowess trigger, Swift Spear's toughness goes up to 3 and becomes very difficult to interact with in combat. It becomes very difficult to trade with a Swift Spear once prowess has been sort of triggered. Goblin Guide always stays as a 2-2 and is pretty easy to block and trade with whenever I need to. So I play out the Tidebinder Mage, name Swift Spear, and she's going to get tapped down for good. The opponent misses his land drop yet again, but hits another Swift Spear. Plays her out, and it's going to choose just to get in with the Goblin Guide here, since I could just eat Swift Spear. I see that he has no mana to be tricky and activate prowess. So smartly leaves this Swift Spear back, attacks with just the Goblin Guide. This time revealing another Aether Vial off the top of the deck. Definitely not optimal, but I have more than enough to do with my hand right now. That Aether Vial is not going to slow me down very much. So I think a little bit about whether or not to block and trade with the Goblin Guide. I like having this Tidebinder Mage on the table, so I'm going to not trade here, just going down to 13. The opponent's stuck on 1 land. I don't feel overly threatened right now. So I move Aether Vial up to 2 counters, and tap 3 mana to play out a Merrow Reejerey. Now I have choices here. I can attack with the Tidebinder Mage, getting in for 3 damage, or bring in the second Lord and get in for 4 damage. The other option is to hope that the opponent attacks in with a Swift Spear and a Goblin Guide. I can then block one of them with the Tidebinder Mage and surprise him with a Lord, potentially blowing him out a little bit. Now, if I play out the second Lord with the Aether Vial, even if he has a bolt for the Reejerey or this Lord, this guy's still going to be a 3-3 and will still be able to eat a Swift Spear even through a prowess trigger. So I choose at this point just to leave the Tidebinder up and surprise Lord waiting in the ranks with Aether Vial. The opponent did hit a second land. He goes down to 18, choosing to bring Stomping Grounds in untapped, and he does go ahead and choose to attack with the Goblin Guide and the Swift Spear. The Goblin Guide trigger reveals a second Tidebinder Mage off the top of the deck, which is really great. Again, it gives me some information, lets me start planning my next turn. I can see that I'm going to be able to slow down his attacks even more with the second Tidebinder Mage. So I'm going to go ahead here and block the Swift Spear with the Tidebinder Mage. It's a 3-3 currently against a 1-2, and I'm going to choose not to block the Goblin Guide. Now the opponent is going to tap 2 lands, going for a Searing Blaze with landfall, having just played that Stomping Ground this turn. He's going to shoot 3 damage over at Merrow Reejerey. Now this is going to give a prowess trigger to the Swift Spear, making it into a 2-3, and the opponent probably thinks he's going to get to eat this this Tidebinder Mage, naming his other Swift Spear. However, with my other Lord waiting in the wings, it's not going to work exactly as well as he had hoped. My Tidebinder Mage will get to eat this Swift Spear while still locking down the other one. The opponent is left with a lockdown Swift Spear and Goblin Guide. I go down to 8 life, draw into that Tidebinder Mage. Just as with the first Tidebinder Mage, we're going to want to get this guy onto the table as quickly as possible. We'll start by playing a Silvergill Adept, revealing the Tidebinder Mage that the opponent already knows about. We draw into another Lord, which is quite good. But I do go ahead, play the Tidebinder Mage out, naming the Goblin Guide, and attack for 5 with the opponent's creatures totally locked down. He goes from 18 down to 13, and with 1 mana open, I'm going to go ahead and play out the second Aether Vial. Opponent hits his third land, but with no creatures on the battlefield, he's looking pretty slow right now. He casts a Wild Negate, currently a 2/2 since there's only a mountain on the table, currently no plains. He does have access to one if he wants to crack Arid Mesa. So no attacks on that turn from the opponent. I'm going to put the AEther Vial that I just played last turn up to 1, and I draw into a Cursecatcher, which is nice because this AEther Vial will get to be really efficient. Okay, so thinking about how this turn could possibly play out, the opponent only has the 1 blocker and access to 2 mana. We know that that can mean a few things. It could mean that he has something like 2 bolts. It could mean that he has something like, well, obviously Destructive Revelry or Tarka's Command, because we can see those cards right now. Neither of those interact with our creatures in any meaningful way. Tarka's Command usually is going to make his creatures bigger and deal 3 damage to my face. Sometimes it's played to put an extra land card on the battlefield to make Wild Negate bigger, surprisingly, like out of nowhere. And sometimes in response to like a Kitchen Finks to prevent me from gaining life, or prevent like an Abzan deck from gaining life. But pretty much it's always +1/+1 to his creatures and 3 to my face. That's not going to hit any of my creatures. In this case, we can see the opponent has access to a Lightning Bolt and potentially mana to pay for a Cursecatcher if I try to counter the Lightning Bolt. Okay, so having looked at the opponent side of things, we can see that he's at 13, and I've got quite a density of creatures on the table between Mutavault, Silvergill, 2 Tidebinders, and a Lord of Atlantis. I can play a second Lord, making everybody bigger, and assuming that the opponent has nothing in his hand, and only this Wild Negate as a 3/3 to block, we're going to have access with this second Lord to 1, 2, 3, 4 creatures with 4 power for 16. 16 power plus the Lord at 3 is going to be 19 total. If Wild Negate blocks one, like for example the Silvergill Adept, to try to trade with it, he would still take 4 times 3 is 12, plus 3 more is 15. So if the opponent had nothing in hand, we would certainly have lethal this turn. If the opponent had something like a Searing Blaze, forcing him to tap out, I could counter that with Cursecatcher and it would still be lethal damage. So after thinking about it for a little while, I decide that with only 1 attacker on his side of the table, and with a Cursecatcher available to counter some burn, I can go ahead and be the aggressor here. So I activate Mutavault and swing in with everybody. The opponent tapped his mountain to cast his Lightning Bolt, targeting the Lord to make everybody else smaller. So since the opponent has mana to pay for Cursecatcher, I just let the Lord die. The opponent then blocks with Wild Negate, cracks the Arid Mesa going down to 12 to get access to a Plains, making his Wild Negate into a 3/3. I bring in the other Lord. The Tidebinder Mage is going to trade with the Wild Negate, keeping the opponent low on creatures, and the opponent's going to take 9 from my 3 other creatures. Absolutely threatening sort of overkill the following turn. So one of my Tidebinder Mages died, the Wild Negate died, and this guy's Swift Spear is finally going to get to untap. The opponent hits his 4th land, and I don't think is very happy with that. We see that he has the Destructive Revelry in hand that can deal 3 damage, or rather 2 damage to me after destroying an AEther Vial, putting me down to 6. Tarka's Command can hit me for 3, putting me down to 3, but this Swift Spear would certainly get blocked, if not by the Lord, then by a Violin Cursecatcher. So yeah, the opponent was unsatisfied with drawing a land and chose to scoop it up at that point. So we saw some interesting plays from the burn player, choosing to leave his fetch land uncracked, choosing not to crack it and play a Swift Spear on turn 1 in order to increase his chances at hitting land. He actually did hit his 2nd land. So whether or not that was the correct play, let you guys think about that one. Please share any comments you have about the match. If you enjoy the videos, please subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks again, and I'll see you later.